My father secretly changed his will to leave everything to my stepmother, saying, "You are too young." The words echoed in my mind like a haunting melody that refused to fade. I stood frozen in the lawyer's office, gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or the distant hum of traffic outside. My father had always been a man of few words but immense actions, actions that spoke louder than any declaration ever could. Yet this was something I could never have anticipated. "You're too young," he had said through his attorney, whose voice carried no emotion, just cold professionalism. Those 4 words hit me harder than any slap across the face ever could. They weren't merely dismissive, they felt like betrayal wrapped in pity. My hands trembled as I stared at the document before me, its neat lines and formal language spelling out a future I hadn't imagined for myself, a future where everything my father owned would go to her, my stepmother, Evelyn. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask why he thought so little of me. But all I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of his decision settle over me like a suffocating blanket. How could he think I was too young? At 26, I had spent years proving myself capable, not perfect perhaps, but certainly not someone who needed to be protected from life's responsibilities. Or maybe that wasn't even the point. Maybe this wasn't about capability at all. Maybe it was about something deeper, darker, hidden beneath layers of secrets we'd never dared to uncover. Growing up, I idolized my father. He was larger than life, a towering figure whose presence commanded respect without him having to say a word. After my mother passed away when I was 12, he became both parents rolled into one, stern yet loving, disciplined yet compassionate. We lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly under wide-open skies. It was a simple life, but it was ours, a sanctuary built on memories of laughter and tears, joy and sorrow. When Evelyn entered our lives 5 years ago, everything changed. She was beautiful, poised, and effortlessly charming, a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity I had grown accustomed to. Their marriage came as a shock to me, though I tried to hide my unease behind polite smiles and forced enthusiasm. Deep down, I resented her, not because she was inherently bad, but because she represented a shift I wasn't ready for. My father seemed different around her, softer somehow, less like the unyielding rock I had always known and more like a man rediscovering parts of himself he thought were lost forever. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Evelyn kept her distance, allowing me to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She never intruded on my space or tried to replace my mother, which I appreciated in theory but found unsettling in practice. There was something almost calculated about her kindness, a precision that left me questioning her motives. Still, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that my discomfort stemmed from grief and insecurity rather than anything concrete. But now, sitting in the sterile office with the evidence of my father's final wishes laid bare before me, those doubts clawed their way back to the surface. Why had he done this? What had Evelyn done to earn such trust, such favor? And most importantly, what did it mean for me? The days following the reading of the will blurred together in a haze of anger and confusion. I couldn't bring myself to confront Evelyn directly, not yet. Instead, I retreated into solitude, spending hours wandering the familiar paths of my childhood home, searching for answers in places where none existed. Every corner held a memory, every room whispered fragments of conversations long past. In the kitchen, I remembered my father teaching me how to make pancakes, his deep laugh filling the air as flour dusted our clothes. In the living room, I recalled nights spent curled up on the couch watching old movies, his arm draped protectively around my shoulders. It was in his study, however, that I found the first real clue, a small leather-bound journal tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk. The pages were worn and yellowed with age, filled with his distinctive scrawl. As I flipped through them, a pattern began to emerge. Entries dated before his marriage to Evelyn spoke of pride and hope, detailing milestones in my life with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. But after their wedding, the tone shifted. Lines grew shorter, thoughts more fragmented. References to me became sparse, replaced instead by cryptic musings about duty, obligation, and sacrifice. One entry in particular caught my attention. Evelyn knows things I cannot explain. She sees the cracks in my armor, the fears I've buried deep within. Perhaps it's time to let someone else carry the burden. Clara is strong, but she doesn't understand, not yet. Clara. That was me. Strong, but ignorant. Burden. Sacrifice. The words swirled in my mind, forming questions I couldn't answer. What burden? What fear? What had Evelyn seen that made her worthy of my father's trust, his estate, his legacy? Determined to piece together the puzzle, I began digging deeper into my father's life. I reached out to old friends, colleagues, anyone who might shed light on the man he had become in his final years. Most offered vague condolences and platitudes, unwilling or unable to provide meaningful insight. But then there was Margaret, my father's lifelong friend and confidant. Her response was immediate and urgent. Come see me. Margaret lived in a quaint cottage nestled among rolling hills, far removed from the chaos of the city. When I arrived, she greeted me with open arms, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. Over steaming cups of tea, she revealed details I had never known, stories my father had kept hidden even from me. He loved you more than anything, she began, her voice trembling slightly. But he also carried guilt for things he couldn't change, choices he regretted. Your mother's death, it destroyed him. For years, he blamed himself, believing he should have done more, been better. And then Evelyn came along, offering him redemption, or so he thought. Redemption. The word hung heavy in the air, laden with implications I struggled to process. Redemption for what? What sins had my father committed that required absolution? Margaret hesitated before continuing, choosing her words carefully. There are rumors, Clara. Whispers about your father's past, things he did before you were born. Things he swore he'd leave behind. Evelyn knew about them. She promised to keep his secret safe, to protect you from the truth. In return, he gave her his trust, and eventually his fortune. The revelation left me reeling. My father, the man I had worshipped, the man I had believed incapable of wrongdoing, harbored secrets so dark they warranted protection. Secrets that Evelyn had leveraged to secure her place in his life, and now in his will. Anger bubbled inside me, hot and consuming. How dare she manipulate him like that? How dare she use his vulnerabilities against him, twisting his love into something transactional? Yet, amidst the fury, a kernel of doubt remained. If Evelyn truly sought only wealth and power, why had she waited until now to claim it? Why hadn't she pushed for control earlier, when my father was still alive to witness it? Something didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. As weeks turned into months, my obsession with uncovering the truth consumed me. I pored over documents, interviewed strangers, followed leads that led nowhere. Each dead end fueled my determination, driving me further into the labyrinth of my father's past. Along the way, I discovered pieces of a narrative that painted a picture far more complex than I had imagined. There were accounts of business deals gone wrong, debts accrued in desperation, alliances forged with questionable individuals. There were whispers of a child, a sibling I had never known existed, born before my parents' marriage and given up for adoption. And there were letters, faded and brittle, written in a hand that mirrored my own, addressed to a woman named Sarah. Sarah. The name resonated within me, stirring emotions I couldn't quite name. Who was she? What role had she played in my father's life? And why had he erased her entirely from our family history? With each new discovery, the image of my father shifted, evolving from the infallible hero of my youth into a flawed, conflicted human being. It was painful, yes, but also liberating. For the first time, I saw him not as a monument to be revered but as a person capable of mistakes, regrets, and redemption. And perhaps in understanding him, I could begin to understand myself. But the journey was far from over. Evelyn remained an enigma, her motivations obscured by layers of half-truths and carefully crafted facades. Was she truly the villain I perceived her to be, or was she simply another victim of circumstances beyond her control? Only time would tell. For now, I clung to the hope that somewhere, amidst the shadows of my father's secrets, lay a path to clarity, a way to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man he really was. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, I could find a way to reclaim the future he had taken from me. The pursuit of answers led me to places I never imagined I'd go, both physically and emotionally. Each revelation about my father peeled back another layer of the intricate web he had woven around his life, and mine. Yet, with every step forward, I felt as though I was being pulled deeper into a vortex of uncertainty. The more I learned, the less I understood. Evelyn remained at the center of it all, an enigmatic figure whose presence loomed large over everything. One evening, after yet another fruitless day of chasing leads, I found myself sitting on the porch of my childhood home. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The world seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to break the stillness. My mind drifted back to Margaret's words. She promised to keep his secret safe. What exactly were those secrets? And why did they seem so tied to Evelyn? A soft rustle behind me startled me out of my thoughts. Turning quickly, I saw her standing there, Evelyn. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, looking nothing like the poised, polished woman I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Her expression was unreadable, neither hostile nor welcoming. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two strangers bound by grief and suspicion. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was hesitant, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the confident demeanor she usually projected. "I know you must have questions." Questions didn't begin to cover it. Anger surged within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was the first time she had approached me directly since the will reading, and I wasn't about to let emotions get in the way of uncovering the truth. "Then start talking," I replied evenly, gesturing for her to sit beside me. She hesitated before taking a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For several moments, she said nothing, staring off into the distance as though gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, deliberately. "You think I manipulated your father," she began, glancing at me briefly before looking away again. "That I somehow coerced him into leaving everything to me. But that's not what happened, Clara. Not even close." Her use of my name caught me off guard. It felt intimate, personal, as though she were trying to bridge the gap between us. I stayed silent, letting her continue. "Your father, he carried burdens most people couldn't fathom. Burdens that weighed heavily on him every single day. He trusted me because I was the only one who knew the full extent of them. And yes, part of that trust involved his decision regarding the will. But it wasn't about money or power, it was about protection." "Protection?" I echoed skeptically. "From what?" Evelyn sighed deeply, rubbing her temples as though trying to stave off a headache. "From himself. From the past. From people who would stop at nothing to destroy him, and anyone connected to him." Her cryptic response only fueled my frustration. "That doesn't make sense. Who are these people? What does any of this have to do with me?" She turned to face me fully then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "It has everything to do with you, Clara. Everything. Your father loved you more than anything in this world. That's why he made the choices he did, to shield you from the dangers he couldn't escape." Her explanation left me reeling. "Shield me? From what?" The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was fragmented and incomplete. Determined to press further, I asked her about Sarah, the name I discovered in my father's letters. Evelyn stiffened visibly at the mention of it, confirming my suspicions that she knew far more than she had let on. "Sarah," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was complicated. A chapter of your father's life he desperately wanted to forget. But some chapters can't be closed, not completely." "What happened to her?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. "And why did he erase her from our lives?" Evelyn hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to my father's wishes and the need to set things right. Finally, she nodded, as though coming to a decision. "I'll tell you. But not here. Not now. Meet me tomorrow at the old mill outside town. Bring nothing but yourself, and an open mind." Before I could respond, she stood up abruptly and walked away, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The old mill? It was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, long abandoned and shrouded in local legends of tragedy and loss. Why would she choose such a place for our meeting? And what truths lay hidden within its decaying walls? The next morning, I arrived at the mill with a mix of apprehension and determination. The structure loomed ominously against the grey sky, its weathered wood groaning softly in the wind. Inside, the air was damp and musty, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. Evelyn stood near the center of the main room, illuminated by shafts of light filtering through broken windows. In her hands, she held a small wooden box. "I brought something for you," she said, holding it out toward me. "Something your father entrusted to me years ago. Something he said you might need one day." I took the box cautiously, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface. It was heavier than I expected, its contents concealed beneath layers of dust and time. Opening it revealed a collection of photographs, documents, and a single key attached to a tarnished chain. Among the items was a faded photograph of my father standing beside a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to me. "Sarah. This is her," Evelyn confirmed, her voice heavy with emotion. "Your half-sister." The revelation hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind out of me. Half-sister? How was that possible? My father had always claimed he had no other children, no family beyond me. Yet here was proof that he had lied, one more secret buried beneath layers of deception. "She's alive," Evelyn continued. "Living under a different name, far away from here. Your father gave her up when he was young, before he met your mother. He thought it was the best thing for her, for both of them. But when she resurfaced years later, demanding answers, it reopened wounds he thought had healed. That's when I entered the picture. He hired me to help protect her, from himself, from others. And eventually, to protect you too." As Evelyn spoke, the full weight of my father's actions began to sink in. Every choice he had made, every lie he had told, stemmed from a desperate desire to shield those he loved from harm. But in doing so, he had created a legacy of secrecy and pain, one that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. And now, faced with the reality of a sister I never knew existed, I realized that the journey was far from over. Uncovering the truth was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in deciding how to move forward, with forgiveness or with vengeance. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man he truly was. And perhaps in doing so I could forge a new path, one built not on secrets and lies, but on honesty and understanding. But first, I needed to meet Sarah. Meeting Sarah became the next step in a journey that had already reshaped my understanding of who I was and where I came from. Armed with the key Evelyn had given me, along with an address scrawled on the back of a faded photograph, I set out to find her. The drive took me through winding roads lined with towering trees, their branches forming a canopy above me as if shielding me from the truth I was about to uncover. My heart pounded in anticipation, each mile bringing me closer to answers, and perhaps closure. When I finally arrived at the small cottage tucked away in the countryside, I hesitated before knocking. The house was modest but charming, with flower boxes spilling over with vibrant blooms and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It looked like a place filled with warmth and life, qualities I hadn't expected when imagining Sarah's existence. Taking a deep breath, I knocked gently. The door opened to reveal a woman who could have been my mirror image. Her hair was darker, her features slightly sharper, but there was no denying the resemblance. She stared at me for a moment, confusion flickering across her face before recognition dawned. "Clara?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. She stepped aside, inviting me in without another word. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread, comforting yet foreign. We sat across from each other at a small wooden table, neither of us speaking for several minutes. Finally, she broke the silence. "I wondered if you'd ever come," she said, her gaze steady despite the vulnerability in her tone. "After Dad passed. I thought maybe you'd want to know." "Dad," I echoed, the word feeling strange on my lips. To me, he had always been just my father, a singular figure in my life. Hearing someone else refer to him so casually was jarring. "Did you know him? Really know him?" Sarah smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and fondness in her expression. "Not as well as I wanted to. He kept his distance, said it was safer that way. But he visited sometimes, wrote letters when he couldn't be here. He loved you, you know, more than anything." Her words stirred conflicting emotions within me. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept that my father's actions, even the ones that hurt, stemmed from love. But another part remained guarded, unwilling to let go of the anger and betrayal I'd carried for so long. "Why did he give you up?" I asked bluntly, needing to hear the answer even though I feared it might break me. She sighed, folding her hands on the table. "Because he thought he was protecting me. Back then, his life was complicated, dangerous, even. He didn't think he could give me the kind of future I deserved. So he made the hardest decision of his life and walked away. But he never stopped caring, Clara. Never." Over the next few hours, we talked about everything, our shared past, our separate lives, and the man who connected us both. Sarah told me stories about our father, stories I'd never heard before, glimpses of a side of him I barely recognized. She spoke of his regrets, his hopes, and the lengths he went to ensure her safety. As painful as some of those revelations were, they also painted a fuller picture of who he truly was, flawed yes, but deeply human. By the time I left Sarah's home, I felt lighter somehow, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. For the first time since reading my father's will, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that his decisions weren't born out of malice or indifference, but out of profound, albeit misguided, love. Returning to my own life, I found myself reflecting on all I had learned. The secrets my father had hidden weren't excuses for his actions, but they provided context, a way to understand why he had done what he did. And while I still struggled with the choices he had made, particularly regarding Evelyn, I began to see them not as betrayals, but as desperate attempts to shield those he cared about from harm. Evelyn, too, became less of a villain in my eyes. Though I would never fully trust her, I came to recognize that she had played a role in safeguarding my family's fractured legacy. In her own way, she had tried to honor my father's wishes, even if it meant making sacrifices of her own. Months later, I stood once again in my father's study, this time with a clearer mind and a fuller heart. The journal I had discovered earlier lay open on his desk, its pages now familiar. I traced my fingers over his handwriting, feeling a sense of connection I hadn't felt before. He wasn't perfect, but he had loved fiercely, and imperfectly. That was something I could forgive. As I closed the journal, I noticed a small envelope tucked inside the cover. Curious, I opened it to find a letter addressed to me. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, reading the words he had written in his final days. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I can only hope that by now, you've begun to understand why I made the choices I did. I know I've caused you pain, and for that, I am truly sorry. But please believe me when I say that every decision I made was driven by love, for you, for Sarah, for everyone I hold dear. I entrusted Evelyn with the responsibility of protecting what matters most, because I knew she would do whatever it took to keep you safe. She may not be perfect, but neither am I. All I ask is that you try to see beyond the surface, to find the truth beneath the layers of secrecy. You are stronger than you realize, Clara. Stronger than I ever was. Trust yourself, trust your instincts, and don't let fear dictate your path. The world is waiting for you, and I know you'll make it proud. With all my love, Dad. Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter, each word piercing my heart with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. For so long, I had resented him for leaving me behind, for placing others' needs above mine. But now, I understood that his actions had been rooted in a love so fierce it blinded him to the consequences. In the months that followed, I worked to rebuild my relationship with Sarah, forging a bond that felt natural despite the years we had lost. Together, we pieced together fragments of our shared history, honoring the man who had shaped both our lives in ways neither of us could have anticipated. With Evelyn, I maintained a cautious friendship, recognizing that while we might never fully reconcile our differences, we shared a common goal, preserving the legacy my father had fought so hard to protect. And as for me, I chose to move forward, not bound by the shadows of the past, but guided by the lessons they taught me. My father's secrets had once seemed like walls, separating me from the truth. But in the end, they became bridges, connecting me to a future I never imagined possible. Sitting on the porch of my childhood home one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, and more whole than I had ever thought possible. And somewhere, I knew my father was watching, finally at peace himself.